You put it on your desktop?
No, I'll just leave it plugged in and then I can get it later.
I'll guess. Do what I think it does.
Install malware on your computer? Probably.
Got a
Yeah, I did too. Oh, no, that seems good.
When you get online, can you tweet a link to the thing?
Oh, these are on.
If you'll tell me.
Which one?
Right.
I'm just going to sign it without reading it because I hear that's a good idea. Yeah. Here you go.
Yeah. Okay. Can I have a pen? Please. Thanks.
That would be about now. The live stream's on.
Thanks.
Now, I guess.
Yeah.
You will tell me this URL?
I think if you,
You want me to work for it?
I need you to work for it, I'm afraid.
Okay. How do I do this?
You would go to Google and search for Yale law enforcement hacking.
Okay. I really have to work for this.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Or you can just retweet.
Don't you have
Jen's
tenure?
tweet of yesterday.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's in Jen Street.
I
Right.
just didn't like it. Yes.
Jen just tweeted it?
No, I tweeted it yesterday, but it's the same link. So you can just look me up.
And just, if you tweet to the video starting now, then I will retweet that too.
So it says tomorrow. Yeah.
Mention that there's live video. You can take out everyone's names.
We're all sort of.
So you're first, Chris.
Yeah. I think that makes sense.
So you're going to lead off the panel? And,
Yeah.
me and then,
What?
no, that's fine.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Should I get started? Okay. Good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. This room is terrifyingly large, and the weather is really bad outside. So I really appreciate you braving the elements. This is a really exciting conference for me. I'm really, really psyched that we have been able to put together a two-panel event focused entirely on the topic of law enforcement hacking, not NSA hacking, not criminal hacking, but law enforcement hacking. And before I begin our panel and introduce my co-panelists, I thought I would start us off with an inspirational video. So this is a this is a commercial from an Italian company who's in the news. I'll tell you a little bit more about them. But this is the commercial for one of their hacking tool hacking products.
You have new challenges today. Sensitive data is transmitted over encrypted channels. Often the information you want is not transmitted at all. Your target may be outside your monitoring domain. Is passive monitoring enough? You need more. You want to look through your target's eyes. You have to hack your target. You have to hit many different platforms. You have to overcome encryption and capture relevant data. stealth and untraceable. Deployed all over your country. Exactly what we do. Remote Control System Da Vinci. The hacking suite for governmental interception. Rely on us.
So, that's a really terrifying video, but this is actually a real video. This is a real marketing video that this company has produced, and this is something that they use to sell their product to really sketchy governments. There we go. All right, so I'm going to give a quick 15-minute introduction to the sort of topic before we get into our panel. I'm really excited about the format of this. So we have a technical panel moderated by Jen Valentino-De Vries from the Wall Street Journal, and then we have a panel of legal and policy experts to follow. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the technology, I thought I would give you a 15-minute introduction to the issue and really why it is now worthy of an event at a law school in the United States. So the company whose video I just showed you is a company called Hacking Team. I'll get into them in a second, but there is now a multi-billion-dollar global market for commercial surveillance technologies. Some of you may know about this. The trade show that many of these companies exhibit at, which is called ISS World, commonly nicknamed the Wiretappers Ball, that conference has gained some infamy. But this is a trade show where companies that manufacture hacking tools and surveillance technology go and show off their wares. And in the last few years, activists, including myself, have infiltrated this conference and obtained marketing materials from these companies. And so it's because people have been able to get the materials from this conference that we've then been able to see how these companies are advertising their products and what the capabilities and features of them are. The company that really has been the biggest name in the commercial hacking software market is a company called Gamma. They recently changed their name to Finfisher. Finfisher was just one of their tools, and Finfisher was a commercial spyware platform capable of getting into a computer and then obtaining video and call data and turning on the microphone and a bunch of other things. Again, most of what we know about this company has actually come out through their own marketing materials. This is an excerpt from one of the marketing videos that this company has produced. You can see here the target is having a Skype conversation with his partner, and then you see this law enforcement official hanging out at their base. And you can see in the top right-hand corner that they can see the target through his own webcam. And this is this demonstration, this marketing demonstration, really shows, I guess, some of the power of this. And the purpose is to be able to capture information from targets through means that no other law enforcement technique could obtain. This is stuff that you cannot get with a normal wiretap. This is stuff that you cannot get with a normal search warrant, either because the police don't know where the target is or because the target is sophisticated and is using sophisticated security and encryption software. This is the CEO of the company, Martin Monk. Martin's background was actually as a developer of open source security software. In fact, many of the big players in this space started off as open source developers of security tools, and apparently open source doesn't pay. So they all seem to have gone into commercial surveillance. Martin, this is my favorite photo of Martin. He's gotten a lot of press in recent years. This is from a Bloomberg profile of him. I'm just going to zoom in to the webcam that he has on his laptop. I don't know how many of you can see it. Oh, it's not there. Unfortunately, the zoom function in PowerPoint doesn't work right now. But there's actually a little sticker over his webcam. So he knows what his own software is capable of and has blocked it. This is a quote from an interview that he gave with the New York Times, saying that his company sells only to monitor criminals. His software is used to monitor criminals, frequently used against pedophiles, terrorists, organized crime, kidnapping, and human trafficking. So the company has positioned themselves as providing these critical, important law enforcement tools only used to catch the worst of the worst. But his company sells its products on a global market, and so he doesn't really have a total amount of control over what happens once he has sold it. This is a copy of an invoice. I'm sorry for the fuzzy text, but the invoice was obtained at the office of the State Security Investigations Department of the Egyptian government in Cairo. So when, during the Arab Spring uprising, activists raided the office of the secret police, and inside the secret police office they found a copy of an invoice from Gamma for its hacking team software. I don't know how much you can see in the bottom of the slide, but they purchased the FinSpy proxy, some licenses, some support. Of course, software isn't very good without support, so they had a tech support contract too. In the wake of these disclosures, about Gamma's contracts with the Egyptian government, Gamma firmly denied that they had sold anything to the Egyptian government. It turns out that was true. The company had not sold anything to the Egyptian government. They had given the Egyptian government a demo and let them use a demo and then sent them a contract for a sale that the Egyptians never bought. So the Egyptians just spied on activists using the demo copy of the software that they'd gotten from this company. And this software had not been used by the Egyptians to go after pedophiles and drug dealers. It had been used to go after activists and journalists. The Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto has done some amazing work mapping out the spread of this technology and its use in various countries. This is very, very timely. The Citizen Lab published a report just last week on a competitor of Gamma's, another company called Hacking Team. So this is Martin Monk just finishing up the piece on this company, saying, quote, "Given that a can of soda or a car battery can be abused and used as an implement of torture, it is of no surprise to anyone that our product can be abused too." So Monk sort of follows the Werner von Braun school of thought. I just make the rockets go up, where they land is not my department. The responsibility for this technology is something that these companies are not terribly keen to embrace. So as I said, there's another company in this space. They're an Italian company called Hacking Team. They haven't gotten as much publicity as Gamma, but their software is quite rich. They're the people who produced that sexy sales video that I opened up with. Hacking Team made the news last week when it was revealed that their software was used to target an Ethiopian journalist in the Washington, D.C. area. It was used by the Ethiopian government to target a journalist in the Washington, D.C. area. And I just saw a headline on Twitter a few minutes ago. It looks like, I think EFF or someone just sued the Ethiopian government on behalf of the activists who were targeted. So this is an issue that is hot in play right now. The way that Hacking Team software is marketed to the public, defeat encryption, total control over your targets, log everything you need, thousands of encrypted communications per day, get them in the clear. So this is software that is sold as a way of getting around the access difficulties that law enforcement and intelligence agencies now face. So this is the headline from last week's story in the Washington Post. And what's interesting here is this is the first known use of this software in the United States, not by a US law enforcement agency, but still US victim. I think it's an interesting milestone. So although these companies have been exhibiting at surveillance trade shows for a while, there hasn't really been a US nexus. Until last year, Hacking Team then opened a sales office in Maryland, in Annapolis, Maryland. Both Hacking Team and Gamma have been showing up at the Wiretappers Ball, this ISS World Conference in the US and elsewhere. They've been showing up for the last sort of 3-4 years, selling their wares, exhibiting their products. Hacking Team also showed up to the Association of Law Enforcement Intelligence Units Conference in Chicago last summer. Not only did the company speak on it, they had a panel specifically about cyber intelligence solutions to data encryption. Again, this is a conference focused at the US law enforcement market. Not only did Hacking Team speak on this panel, but they also paid for the coffee break at the midway through the conference. So I don't actually, the purpose of this conference, of course, is to talk about law enforcement. I don't have any evidence to say that Hacking Team or Gamma's software is in use in the United States by law enforcement right now. I don't have a smoking gun. The closest I have is the fact that they have been actively exhibiting and, their wares at conferences aimed at the US law enforcement market. If they have not sold their software to a local law enforcement agency in this country or a federal agency, it is not because they haven't been trying. They're trying really, really hard. And I don't think they would be showing up year after year after year at this conference if they weren't selling this stuff. Okay, but so those are the local guys. The Hacking Team and Gamma software is aimed at smaller governments without the budgets to develop custom tools, and then it's also aimed at local and state guys. So you may have a scenario where the police in a small town in Germany are using the same hacking software as the Syrian government or the Egyptian government or the Indonesian government. But federal law enforcement in the United States, they have enough money that they don't need to buy $200,000 hacking software. They can go for the big bucks and develop custom bespoke software from a company like Harris or Raytheon or Booz Allen, one of these big Beltway defense contractors. So this is Valerie Caproni, who was until a few years ago the general counsel for the FBI. She was testifying before Congress maybe 2 or 3 years ago at a hearing about expanded law enforcement powers, and she said, quote, "There will always be very sophisticated criminals that are virtually impossible to intercept through traditional means. The government understands that it must develop individually tailored solutions for those sorts of targets." So Valerie didn't say the word hacking at that hearing, but when she said individually tailored solutions, that is the blinking light saying that the FBI has hacking capabilities. And it took us a couple years to actually figure out really what the FBI was doing. Jen published a story last August that was based in part on some of my LinkedIn sleuthing. She was able to get someone to go on record to say, quote, "The Bureau can remotely activate the microphones in phones and laptops without a user knowing." Then the Washington Post in December, based on a criminal case that had surfaced, was able to dig a little bit deeper, and they got a former FBI official to confirm on the record that the FBI not only can enable webcams without anyone knowing, but they can turn off the light on the webcam. So there's this indicator light on webcams that everyone thought was hardwired into the camera, and it's actually not the case. The light is controlled separately, and so there was actually a demonstration that was done at the Washington Post office that they recorded and put online. However, the one saving grace for the people in my community is that the FBI is apparently loath to use these tools when investigating hackers because they fear that suspects will discover and publicize the techniques. And that's actually a point that I hope people will get into in the second panel, which is that one of the main issues that's coming up here is the secrecy. The FBI has this really powerful tool and doesn't want anyone to know about it because they're worried that then it won't be useful anymore. And so they're doing everything in their power to make sure that the existence and the capabilities of these tools stay below the radar. Okay, so the FBI has this team, they're called the Remote Operations Unit. All they do is hack into computers. They don't go out and do wiretaps. All they do is hack into computers. They're based in Quantico, and they work on a bunch of cases. We don't know too much about the contours of their software, its various capabilities. What we've seen has come out from a few court cases, but certainly we should assume that it's just as robust as the software that Gamma and Hacking Team are selling. We should assume that they have just as sophisticated features, if not better, since they're paying so much more. But the technical issue that I'm really hoping to tee up, because I think it'll be useful for our panel, and I think it'll be really useful for the lawyers and policymakers who follow us, is to talk about the 3 installation vectors that the government can use to get into someone's computer. And you know, there may be a discussion about the government using zero-day vulnerabilities later on, but that actually isn't a very big deal. The question isn't how do they circumvent the security on your computer, it's actually how do they get the software onto your computer in the first place. And there's sort of 3 main paths. So one is social engineering, phishing, emails that try and trick you into clicking on links or getting you to install software on your own computer. This is a screenshot from the report that Citizen Lab put out last week. This is a conversation between what is likely an Ethiopian government official and a journalist in Virginia. So this is from one of his friends who he hasn't spoken to in a long time, saying, please accept this article, looking forward to hear your comments. This is a Skype conversation, and the article is a .rar file, which is similar to a zip. So this is some kind of archive. And luckily the journalist didn't actually click on this because he thought, if this is a Word document, why is it an archive? So he tells the guy, if it's a Word document, it should have an extension like doc or docx, not .exe or .rar. And so the guy works for a while and then comes back and says, oh, here's the Word document. So he tries a second time, this time with a Word document. And really what I'm showing here first is that one of the reasons why we've even learned anything about this technology is many of the people who are using it are inept, but also that they were really hoping that just by having a Word document with information about protest, that would lead to an activist or a journalist clicking on it. And it turns out, in many cases, that actually does work. But it's not always going to work. The government cannot rely on people being dumb enough to click on links, either because people will get smarter or because companies like Google and Yahoo will start to be better about policing phishing emails and malicious links. So phishing and social engineering doesn't scale. It doesn't get them 100% coverage, and so there are going to be other ways that governments are going to try and get information. So Finfisher actually sells, the company that produces some of this hacking software, actually sells a solution to this problem. It's called FinSpy ISP, and it's an appliance that the government can put into a data center of an internet company and maliciously attack users of that service. So I think I have one more video. Let's see. Can I show that? Yeah. They all seem to have this cheesy music. Sorry about that.
Hope you cleared the copyright.
All right, so clearly hacking team spends a little bit more money on their videos than Gamma does. So just to unpack that for those of you who didn't fully grasp it. So what this software does, this is from their marketing materials, FinFly ISP is a strategic, countrywide, as well as mobile solution that can be integrated into an internet service provider's core network to remotely install the remote monitoring solution on select targeted systems. It's able to infect files that are downloaded by the target on the fly. Any file that's downloaded by the target can be sort of hijacked and a virus added to it, or they can infect the target by sending fake software updates for popular software. So in the video, you see the person getting an iTunes software update. People are, of course, used to getting regular updates from Apple that they just ignore the terms of service to and click install, install, install. Well, that iTunes software update can be malicious. The new release, this is obviously marketing material, so they oversell it, but can infect targets on the fly by just visiting any website. And so really what this does, this kind of technology, and Gamma is not the only company that sells this stuff, this takes hacking to a new level of efficiency because you don't have to rely on the user clicking a particular link. The user visiting any link is good enough. The user visiting his or her email, or doing a search on a commercial search engine, or downloading a screensaver or an app from an app store. Any download, any web browsing that's not encrypted is enough to then trigger this kind of malicious software installation. So this is really, really powerful, and you can imagine that this is a very popular tool with governments. Unfortunately, for the government who would use this, they cannot use this by themselves. The police cannot just, put this in their own office. They need the help of a company like Comcast or Verizon or AT&T. They need the help of a broadband internet company that would supply the target with internet access, or an upstream provider like Level 3. But with a device that lets them inject malware into a network, the government no longer has to try and trick people into installing software. And so this is a vector that, that you would imagine is going to become more frequently used. Gamma brags on their website that this is very favorably looked at by law enforcement. All right, so the last installation vector, in addition to the companies that control our network connections, there are also the companies that control the software that is already on our computers. So many of us have mobile devices that are either connected to Google's Play Store or Apple's App Store, and our devices are configured to basically call home and get updates on a regular basis from these companies. Any app that you have can generally give you an update. And there's no reason to believe that these companies could also not be approached by the government. I'm not going to go into the legal issues as to when and how the government could get an order demanding that kind of assistance to deliver malware, but certainly these companies have the ability to deliver updates to our devices, mobile or otherwise. And even if the government doesn't get the help of these companies, the update mechanism that these companies have built can be hijacked. So, for example, last year or 2 years ago, we learned that the people who were behind Flame, which is this piece of sophisticated government malware, largely believed to be the work of the US, they took advantage of a very obscure security flaw and convinced infected computers that they were Windows Update. It's a long way of saying they took advantage of the fact that every Windows computer was pre-configured to get security updates from Microsoft, and they masqueraded as Microsoft to Microsoft's users and used the update mechanism to deliver malware. Again, this raises some really interesting legal questions. Can a government impersonate a company to their users in order to deliver malware? I don't know the answer to that, but I think as we plot out the future of this issue, and as we seek to get our heads around it and explore the interesting policy questions, I actually don't think the interesting ones are going to be what can the government do once they're on your computer? What can they turn on your webcam? Can they turn on your microphone? I think the interesting questions are going to be how do they get on your computer in the first place, and whose arm can they twist to get on there in the first place? All right, so with that introduction out of the way, how do we want to do this? I guess I should introduce Jen Valentino-De Vries, who's our moderator, who will take it from here.
So thanks so much for coming. So I'm really excited about this panel. In addition to Chris, who has been a longtime researcher into this area and is now at the ACLU and a visiting fellow here at Yale, we have Matt Blaze, who is an associate professor of computer science. Sure, I'll take it. He teaches computer science things at UPenn. He's an expert in cryptography and computer security, and he's really well known for finding security flaws in government systems, systems that attempt to allow law enforcement to have access to people's communications, and his finding of flaws has a tendency to kill such systems and thwart their implementation. So he'll be talking a little bit about that. And we have Axel Arnbach. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay.
I'll take it.
Who's also a computer security researcher. He is from the University of Amsterdam and is currently in the US this year at the Berkman Center at Harvard and down at Princeton doing research for his PhD. So I think, did you have anything else you wanted to add, Chris?
No.
Okay, so I think we'll start with Matt.
Okay. So I'm going to go up here just. So I do not have any PowerPoint So let me either apologize or toot my horn for that. I want to just talk a little bit about the history that got us here and what I see as some of the technical questions that law and policy need to get together to help us answer on the topic that we're going to be discussing today. And really to understand where we are today, it's really necessary to go back to the 1990s, to a time that's become popularly known a bit reductively as the crypto wars. In the early 1990s, the US government, and it was really alternately the FBI and the National Security Agency taking the lead on this, but really primarily the FBI, was sounding the alarm that wiretaps were imminently going to go dark because of advances in or changes to communications technology and computing. The phrase going dark wasn't used then. It was just that we were going to lose a very important wiretapping capability. And there were two reasons that they cited for this. The first reason was that the communications landscape was changing. In the early 1990s, the primary communications device, voice communications device that we were using was the landline analog telephone. And landline analog telephone technology is had been essentially unchanged at its core for almost 100 years at that point. Two wires to your home, going between your home and a central office that contained analog signaling as well as analog audio with all of your telephone calls. Tapping an analog circuit to your home was pretty much as simple for a period of 100 years as finding the wires going to your home somewhere between the central office and your telephone and connecting a bridge tap, a pair of alligator clips at its crudest, or something a little more sophisticated, but not much more sophisticated than that, and recording or listening to what's on the line. And that technology had been, in use by law enforcement since at least as early as the 1920s, and the tapping technology had been essentially unchanged since then. By the early 1990s, a couple of things started to threaten the analog telephone as the dominant communications device. There was a technology that's been mostly forgotten called ISDN, in which those signals were replaced by digital signals, but probably most importantly, cellular phones, in which those wires were replaced by a radio link, and your phone is no longer at a fixed location that can be well defined and isolated. So the emergence of these new technologies that essentially made or threatened to make old-fashioned wiretapping obsolete led law enforcement to say, look, we need the telephone industry, as they deploy these new technologies, to design them to allow for the same kind of wiretapping we're used to doing by connecting two wires to the phone's last mile, even if those two wires no longer exist. And they lobbied extensively over a period of several years for what ultimately was passed as the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, which mandated that all public switched telephone providers, that is cellular companies, ISDN providers, and later this has been interpreted to include and amended to include things like cable modem phone providers, and FiOS-like services, would have to provide as part of their infrastructure the capability to isolate individual conversations and deliver them to law enforcement in exactly the way that they used to be able to tap just by getting to the two wires. And this was controversial, and it remains controversial for reasons that I'll get into in a moment, because this was a design mandate. Old-fashioned wiretapping on the old analog systems wasn't designed into the system. It was just a side effect of the way phones happened to work. So now we have wiretapping built in as a deliberate design feature, as opposed to just a consequence of the natural design. Today, law enforcement continues to lobby to expand this mandate to things like internet services and other communications technologies that don't fit into the traditional CALEA mandate. Again, we'll get to whether that's a good idea in a little while. The second way in which the government, primarily law enforcement, but also the security agencies, sounded the alarm in the 1990s was the emergence of cryptography, in particular end-to-end cryptography, as a way of securing conversations. Cryptography would allow essentially the service provider to be cut out of the equation for delivering wiretaps. If my telephone encrypts to your telephone when we have a conversation, being able to tap the conversation midway along the line will be useless without the correct keys. So the government proposed a system called key escrow, in which designers of systems using cryptography would have to include essentially the equivalent of the CALEA backdoor in the crypto algorithms, so that the government could decrypt conversations that they intercepted by obtaining a copy of the key through a deliberate backdoor. This was also controversial. In fact, it was much more controversial than the CALEA mandate. Telephone companies are sort of this well-regulated big entities, whereas crypto is very easy to implement, essentially in software at no marginal cost. A question of what the risks of including deliberate backdoors in cryptography was, really a very serious one, and this was resisted very, very heavily to the point where there was really a very decisive policy decision in the other direction from CALEA, in which we essentially said, no, this is not a good idea, and the government really should not mandate a backdoor in cryptography algorithms that are used to protect our critical infrastructure. It's too risky, it's too expensive. And by 2000, the government had essentially backed down and agreed with this position, allowing essentially unrestricted use of cryptography, and even in some cases actively encouraging it, with the recognition that the internet was becoming more and more important as a national security thing in its own right. So, here we have this sort of mixed message from the 1990s that said, wiretapping is important enough to preserve that we'd pass a law like CALEA, but we need to do this without creating undue risks. So what happened since then? Well, an interesting thing is that the worst predictions of law enforcement about what cryptography would do to wiretaps has not, at least not yet, come true at all. There's an annual wiretap report on law enforcement wiretaps in which the number of intercepts in which encryption prevented recovery of evidence is reported, and that number is either 0 or a single-digit number in every year. In fact, I think this last year was the highest number, and it was something like 6, of which only a couple ended up actually preventing recovery of evidence. It's a vanishingly small number of cases. So what's going on here? How is, in spite of the fact that we have reliable crypto, it's included in almost everything, why is the government not thwarted by this? And there are a number of reasons for this. One reason, probably among many, is that tools like the ones that Chris described in his introduction are being used to recover clear text from the endpoints by hacking into the computers, obtaining the computers in whatever way. So we have this kind of leads us to a big technical policy question. How do we want to balance law enforcement's desire to be able to obtain wiretap evidence and other evidence from computers against our desire and our need to secure computers against attacks by others and prevent abuse of these systems that we rely on very, very heavily. And this is really a question of balancing risks, two approaches. You know, in one approach, we have the sort of CALIA and key escrow approach, in which the infrastructure is mandated, you know, global infrastructure used by everyone is mandated to be made deliberately weak to provide a backdoor for the government. In the other approach, we essentially ask the government to do what they do when they want to obtain evidence from a house or a business, which is find a way to break into that particular place, break in perhaps at some risk, perhaps at some cost, and obtain the evidence against the targeted individuals. But, you know, essentially this is, to bring this to an analogy to the physical world, you know, this is a question of, do we want to have physical searches conducted by mandating that we have weak locks that can be picked by the government on all of our doors, or do we want to give the police sufficiently large battering rams that when they do want to break into a place, they're able to break in? The weakened infrastructure approach is much more like having a pickable lock on everyone's door, and who knows who might have the skills to pick it, versus the large battering ram that you know, the police may abuse, but it can be used essentially only against particular targets. Now, there are a number of difficult technical questions here. You know, one question is, if the government is using computer compromise tools, how easy are these tools to abuse? How likely is it that they will get out of hand, and can they be used at a larger scale than the targeted surveillance that's anticipated by the Constitution? And, you know, is it reliable enough to serve as a viable alternative to global weaknesses? That is, you know, will the government reliably be able to use these tools in a way that it doesn't need to mandate weak infrastructure for all of us? Now, I've written on this subject. I believe the answer to those questions is the lesser evil is figuring out how to manage these targeted tools. That I believe that global interception mandates and globally weakened infrastructure are extraordinarily dangerous, whereas these targeted tools are potentially quite dangerous, but they're very similar to weapons and battering rams and other tools that we manage with law enforcement in any case. But I think that's the topic for the rest of the day, and with that, I'll turn it over to Axel.
All right.
Sorry. Let's see. Can you do that?
Sure can.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Chris, for organizing this, and thanks you all for coming. It's extremely cold, not only outside but also inside, right? So I'm going to stretch out a bit, and feel free to do so.
For warmth.
Yes, exactly. I'm a bit in limbo here. So I'm both interested in computer science, but I'm actually at the law school. I'm from Europe, and I'm in the United States. So what I'm going to do is talk about two specific cases of law enforcement hacking in Europe, and at the end raise a couple of policy questions and also technical questions that they have raised in debates in the Netherlands and in Germany. My main point here for today is that law enforcement hacking is a bit like this Hydra, this mythological figure. Whenever you find an answer, or you think you found an answer in the law enforcement hacking debate, 10 new questions pop up. And it's super important to have this debate right now, because if we won't, probably those new questions that will come up are being obscured, as very much has happened on the European scale. Now, always when I come to an audience in the United States, I said this is not a beauty contest between comparing one legal system as opposed to another. It's just very informative to see that basically because the constitutional framework in Europe is somewhat different than here, law enforcement needs a specific basis in the law before it can actually do something. So a lot of the discussions on the EU scale have actually emerged a lot of data, a lot of concrete cases rather than hypotheticals. So it's really informative to see. Moreover, the Netherlands being a small country and always friendly to the United States in this space, the Netherlands is very much a playing ground for the United States. As the first case that I will discuss will show, there was a large lobbying effort behind the scenes of particularly the US Secret Service for the Dutch law enforcement agencies to pursue. So this, let's see, okay, well, I can do it like this. Yeah, okay, where's the, well, this works as well, right? F11, alrighty. The first case is the Bredola botnet. So if you were online on 25 October 2010 and you got this warning screen on your computer, it meant that your device was infected with a botnet. It was a warning screen that was installed by the Dutch law enforcement and a couple of private sector companies using the same botnet they had hacked into to actually push out closed source, non-verifiable code towards all the infected machines, spurring this warning debate. It was a huge debate, not only because there was no legal basis at the moment, so the Dutch law enforcement agencies broke the law, not only because this happened in many places in the world, so the Dutch law enforcement agencies actually violated this very basic principle in law enforcement of territorial jurisdiction, but also because the code could not really be verified. And, but on the other hand, this was apparently a pretty serious botnet, so a large debate ensued, which led to the introduction of a legal provision, which I will return to later. So what happened? Some of the technical aspects. Very quickly, a botnet is basically this technical infrastructure in which you have a bot herder, which actually controls from a command and control server the botnet, and then the bot client, which are all the infected machines. Now, so the botnet is more or less, and very usually also in this case, it serves as a platform where the bot herder, who controls the botnet, can, offer all sorts of services to other cyber criminals that can use the platform, for example, to look for credit card data or whatever. This last bullet is important. The botnet scale, in this case, botnets can grow very big. It has been, in the news, in the tech news mostly, now for some years. This particular Bredola botnet was purportedly 30 million infected devices all over the world, a number that was largely exaggerated. I won't go too much into the technical details, but the number was rather 20 times lower, according to Microsoft data. But 1.5 million machines spread all over the world. Difficult, very challenging technical problem, and what is law enforcement to do? So the botnet ran on servers that were hosted by a very legit, one of the biggest hosting companies in the world called LeaseWeb, which at one point uncovered this and contacted local law enforcement authorities in the Netherlands. Now, what happened is that the servers at the hosting companies were wiretapped, and because the bot header didn't apply encryption on the VPN connection, so the encrypted connection between the command and control servers and all these computers, so purportedly over 1 million. And the cookie, so the VPN was encrypted, but the cookie that was sent with the login credentials to the VPN was not, and that meant that the Dutch law enforcement agencies were able to gain access to the command and control server, basically to hack it, but not by using malware, but basically by using the credentials and getting in there. So there were 2 hacks in this case. One is when the command and control server was infiltrated, observed for a month, and very hysterically, completely staged on the national 8 o'clock news. They pulled the plug on the botnet. In fact, basically just shutting down some bleeping server lights. It was completely silly. They were immediately ridiculed for that. But the second hack happened, of course, when the local law enforcement authorities actually used the botnet to spread out or to push out this warning screen that I just showed you before, to install this unpublished executable warning screen. And on the warning screen was a link that users could follow and patch their machines. Now, as I told you, the hacking was across borders. The bot herder, so the one controlling the command and control servers located in the Netherlands, was an Armenian guy. But all the bot clients were, of course, spread all over the internet. Very importantly, also technical aspect here of this case, is that the local law enforcement agencies only shut the command and control server down. So the botnet, all these infected machines, were reconnected to a new command and control server within days, and the botnet continued. This is something that is completely not part of the public debate. Local law enforcement agencies stood up and were very excited about themselves and exaggerated the numbers in an order of magnitude, or maybe even 20 times. So, a lot of interesting questions I'll come back to, but one thing Bits of Freedom did, this is also, for full disclosure, part of my bio. In 2009, I was part of a core team to resurrect like this Dutch version of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. But one very important question that remains unresolved is the role of antivirus companies. I will come back to this later, so when the Dutch law enforcement agencies hacked into the command and control server and also into all the other servers, what is your antivirus company going to do when you spread known malware to come back? I'll come back to this later. So a story of 2 weeks ago, or maybe last week even, is Utopia. Utopia is the new Silk Road. Silk Road was taken down here in the United States, has gotten a lot of media coverage, but it resurfaced again under the name Utopia. But the Dutch law enforcement agency were able to shut down Utopia quite quickly again, and this was done by good old undercover police work. No hacking involved, no malware involved, which points at, and this is maybe something for the debate as well, there's not only 2 approaches. There's always many more approaches to pursue for law enforcement, and here this was basically law enforcement undercover agents offering some products for sale and via getting to the administrators. Second case I want to talk about is, and this is very vital, the Bundestrojaner case. These Germans are always so fantastic in framing these issues, right? But already since 2006, not the federal government, but one of the state governments in Germany had adopted a legal provision to enable law enforcement hacking, and a lawyer, a journalist, and I think a doctor challenged this specific legal provision on the state level at the Federal Constitutional Court. So this was not really an instance of law enforcement having hacked and a concrete case getting up to the courts, but this was a legal provision. But this legal provision was not about, using credentials that you already know. This was about a Trojan, so writing malware specific for hacking a target's computer. Now, in Germany, for all sorts of cultural and constitutional traditions, this was a very, very big case, and it was struck down. So why, in this case, and this is important, was the law enforcement hacking shut down? In this 2008 case, the German Constitutional Court decided, it's called the Online Durchsuchung case, in case you want to look at it, that law enforcement hacking violates the core of privacy and the personality. So it's law enforcement hacking. If you hack an IT system, you gain access to so many sensitive data. It goes beyond communication and under German constitutional law, even beyond a house search or breaking into someone's house. Why is this? This is because IT is intertwined with daily life, according to the ruling. And very interestingly, the technical details in this ruling are super well researched. Even guys from the Chaos Communication Club, like the Hacker Club, the famous Hacker Club in Germany, were testifying before the courts. They say, well, on an IT system, we actually structure our data, you know, we use folders. So what we actually do, we make life for law enforcement so easy. Once they're in, they have this whole neat data structure. It's all in folders. It's all right there. And it really makes hacking into systems the easiest way possible. So that means that the threshold for law and policy should be extra high. A question for the other panel, of course. What it also addressed is that IT systems in the future, this is in 2008, will be increasingly networked and increasingly part of a cloud or part of a network. So when you're into one systems, it will be very tempting for law enforcement to get in all sorts of other systems or to listen into third-party communications. So that's why the 2008 court, and this was something that nobody really expected, in Germany introduced a new constitutional value, a human right to the confidentiality and integrity of IT systems. And this is beyond freedom of expression, this is beyond privacy, this is beyond communication secrecy, this is beyond the First Amendment, beyond the Fourth Amendment, a new constitutional right to the confidentiality and integrity of IT systems. And the tech people in the crowd will see that they followed this well-known confidentiality, integrity vocabulary in information security. And this applies to any storage device. So whether this is a PC, a smartphone, MP3 player, and even in the ruling in 2008, they talked about the Internet of Things, which is a very important development that we should also address here. I mean, whenever our toasters or our fridges start being connected to the Internet as well, and whenever the court ruling says these devices have a general purpose possibility, so when you can store any data on it, even your fridge will get a certain amount of constitutional protection. This is not absolute, but the strictest criteria apply. We can talk more about this in the debate, but it means that judicial review, there must be a concrete, so actual factual threat to the life of citizens or the state, which in German law is basically terrorism. And there's a couple of other substantial criteria. Now, to round this up, there is a separation that the court ruling makes between wiretapping and between actually gaining access to a system. Because if you wiretap, you're only listening to the communication. But you know, if you're onto a system, there's so much more you can do. The Chaos Computer Club, even though it was very excited about the ruling, started to do some port scanning and found the malware, the government malware in the wild, even though it had been prohibited under the Constitutional Court ruling. And what it found was quite striking. It reversed engineered these Bundestrojaner. This was 3 years after the court ruling, and found that all sorts of false claims were made by the German law enforcement agencies. So basically it said, well, the Trojan is, the law enforcement claimed this Trojan is only for wiretapping at the source. It has not more capabilities. This is not to remotely search computers, etc. And what it also claimed is that Trojans are developed in a case-specific way, so they're custom-made for a particular investigation, exposing or exploiting particular vulnerabilities, and every single exploit that we use is part of a quality audit that we make ex ante. Well, the reverse engineering, of course, showed something very, very problematic and something very different. It showed that every exploit or every Bundestrojaner included an upgrade path. So it included a direct communications channel back to the law enforcement agencies with an upgrade path to expand the capabilities of the malware. This was built in from the start. What it also found is that all the Trojans circulating out there in the wild were using similar software, similar functionality, and even the same cryptographic keys. This is very problematic from a technical perspective because this exposes the malware deployed in the wild to some serious security issues. The commands from the law enforcement to each and every Trojan were unencrypted, and the intercepted data from the wiretap was very poorly encrypted. So what are the implications? Just 3 of them is that evidence used in the court cases became highly contentious because anyone could actually, hop on to the Trojan and install whatever kind of documents on a suspect's computer, or at least when the security is open, defendants can claim this in a court case. Burden of proof became very difficult. Well, another thing is that the poor security made it able for anyone to actually exploit the malware and perform a man-in-the-middle attack on the law enforcement systems and on the suspects' systems. Even on the law enforcement systems, try to think about the implications. If you can use the malware that they use, you can reverse engineer it and exploit it to hack into law enforcement systems. That would be seriously problematic, right? And a third implication is that the malware was so poor that it was really easy to copy it and to impersonate the authorities for hacking purposes. That was also a serious problem. So here are my questions. From the 2 concrete cases we've seen out there in the wild, we can sort of conclude that law enforcement hacking is a hydra. So every time you think you have slayed one head of the monsters, 10 new pop back. For example, if you think about hacking tools, they've always, even though there was like a specific discussion and in Germany a specific basis in the law created, the hacking tools have always been obscure, always part of false claims by law enforcement, and never transparent. The function, even though the claim was that it only was for wiretapping in the German case, for example, remote search was built into the software, and there was a huge spillover effect with all sorts of other risks. Now, scope is also a problem. Like, is this really going to be the case in the real world, if you think about it, that malware made by the government is only used in one particular case, or only targeted to one person, or will this also be used to target a group that are part of the same connected network? Or, well, this is not about the NSA, right? Or to hack into 100,000 routers all over the world. Then there's a cybersecurity aspect, the case I talked about. So what is the role of antivirus companies? Are they going to let government malware pass and thus make our systems more insecure? If we look at the German malware, that was really poorly engineered, but if all the important antivirus companies now let that go through, I mean, that exposes the entire ecosystem to a lot of security flaws. Well, then the question is of constitutional rights. Apart from the First and the Fourth Amendment, do we need newer protections? Do we need a new constitutional right for IT systems, like in Germany? So many more questions. We haven't even really talked about jurisdiction, right? So what about this Dutch law enforcement case where they basically hacked all over the world? Isn't that a geopolitical Pandora's box? I mean, if we're going to hack into a system in well, whatever country in the world, Iran, China, Russia. I mean, that's what you always hear on this side of the world, right? But, and they discovered that the Dutch law enforcement agencies has hacked into an important critical systems. Does that give them sort of the moral high ground or the moral ground to hack back? And then very importantly, and I think that is really the central question, if we make a cost-benefit analysis in this very controversial area, do we really need hacking tools in the, well, what has been often called the golden age of surveillance? I mean, there are so many different ways to enforce the law, right? Even the Dutch or the German Constitutional Court ruling goes into this. I mean, there is so many ways to prosecute crime in this interconnected age where we all have a smartphone in our pocket. We submit our location every moment of the day. Do we really need this? Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so we've got about 15 minutes for debate and questions, I think. And so part of this panel, the point of this panel is to kind of set up the discussion for the next panel on the legal issues around law enforcement hacking. So if you have any questions that can help you, understand the technical issues and then better think about the legal issues, please feel free to raise your hand. I've got a couple questions that I want to make sure we discuss. So kind of to start out with, I think there was an interesting discussion about active hacking, which Chris described, and mandated backdoors. There are also certain tools that are making use of vulnerabilities that seem intractable. So kind of in the cell phone network, for example. And I'm curious what your views are from a technical standpoint. Is one of those definitely worse than the other, or are they pretty much equivalent?
I mean, we don't have a secure telephone network. We don't have a secure internet right now either. The fact that Gamma can put a box into a data center and infect every single user who uses that internet company when they are checking their email or browsing the web, that suggests that we don't have a secure internet. The only thing keeping us safe right now is that the companies who are providing us with upstream service are not doing bad things. But when you go to Starbucks, everyone else in Starbucks could pretend to be your upstream provider. We don't have a secure internet, and I think we need one. And until we have one, we are not only vulnerable to our own governments using these tools, but we are also vulnerable to plenty of other governments using these tools. So even if you think that, let's say Hacking Team had sold their software to the police in Arizona. If you think that the police in Arizona should be able to hack a computer with a court order, that's fine, but Hacking Team is also selling their software to the Ethiopian government and the Vietnamese government and the Tunisian government. And it's quite clear that the Ethiopian government is more than happy to use their software to target people in the United States. Local cops in this country are never going to have the budgets for exclusive hacking tools. They're not going to have, they don't have enough money to buy something that will only be available to them. And so there will necessarily be law enforcement agencies sharing tools. And you may not like every other agency or every other government that has those tools, and you cannot keep people exposed to one without keeping them exposed to all of them. There's sort of a hierarchy as well. You have like the cyber warfare and the cyber espionage and then the regular law enforcement. And there's no way to protect yourself from cyber espionage and cyber warfare but still be vulnerable to the cops. And the other way goes, it also applies. I think that, we have to understand that we need to secure our systems. But as long as the police, as long as the FBI are engaged in exploitation of security vulnerabilities, their incentives are never really going to be structured in the right way, right? So how does the FBI go out and say that they're investigating the Target data breach, that cybersecurity is a threat faced by this country, that that they are a serious player on this issue when they are taking advantage of the very same flaws and the same techniques that the people who steal hundreds of millions of credit card numbers are also doing?
at the risk of turning this into a debate, this debate into a debate, let me say that I agree with most of what you said, Chris, but let me just take issue with a couple of points there. First of all, I mean, you described something which I think is really scary, which is not exploitation of endpoint devices, but also exploitation of the infrastructure itself. And I think, we can kind of all agree that exploiting flaws in infrastructure is, just as bad as mandating that there be flaws in infrastructure. It's very important that we shore that up. But, my computer and my cell phone, and I'm a computer security specialist. I have no idea how to defend these devices against a targeted attack. The only difference is that as a specialist in this subject, I know how vulnerable I am, as opposed to, being a little bit blissfully ignorant. And these devices are weak, not because the government wants them to be weak, although that may be true, but even if it weren't the case, these devices are fundamentally going to be weak because nobody has the first idea of how to build something as complex as this little box and have it actually be secure. How many of you have written a computer program? Well, how many of you, I suspect most of you have at least tried. How many of you have written a computer program that didn't quite work as you expected it to do? Well, speaking on behalf of computer science, we're not any better at it than you are. We just build bigger things that are more dangerous when we have flaws in them. And that's essentially always going to be true. I think we should work very hard to make our devices as secure as we can. But it's just a fool's errand to think that if we tell the FBI not to try to exploit this, that somehow that's magically going to make everything secure. We just don't know how to do it.
I think that the government cannot be engaged in efforts to protect the security of systems and also simultaneously be exploiting the vulnerabilities in those systems. I think that puts the government in a position where it has a fundamental conflict of interest. And right now, there are law enforcement agencies that are wearing two hats. There are agencies like DHS that have a cybersecurity mission that also have agents who are either using these tools or certainly trying out demos for these tools and about to buy them. And I really think that it just it makes it too difficult for agencies to be pure in their mission of protecting our systems. I'm not in no way disputing what Matt is saying. The more that I learn about technology, the more terrified I am about how insecure my data is. At this point, the thing that scares me the most is my cell phone, and it should scare every single one of you. Phones are just a disaster. But again, what I want to stress here is it's not just your law enforcement. It's not just the law enforcement in your state. It's not just the law enforcement in the neighboring state. We're talking about other governments that you may not think follow the rule of law. I want to let Axel speak, but I just want to make one other major point here. The reason that I've been focusing on law enforcement hacking and a similar and equally scary technology, which is the Stingray. The Stingray is a form of cell phone tracking technology. The reason I've spent 3 years focusing on these two particular techniques is because they are both unmediated surveillance techniques. So when the government goes to Google and they say, we believe that Chris is a bad guy, we want his emails. And Google says, well, we see stuff in the news about Chris. He doesn't seem like that bad of a guy, so get a warrant. And the government says, well, we don't really want to get a warrant. And Google says, well, if you don't have a warrant, you don't get the data. Right? When you have a third party in a process that is typically happening in an ex parte manner, where you don't have a defense counsel who's present, the companies can sort of act as an independent proxy for the user. They're not always going to have their incentives aligned with the user, but they, in some cases, will push back, particularly when this stuff is so high-tech and judges just don't really grasp the finer details or may not be told about the finer details of what they're being asked to do. Companies can be an effective proxy, but for technologies like Stingrays, where the police can just show up outside your house and send radio waves through your wall to read the information off your phone, or when the police can just hack into your computer, then there's no one standing between the police and your data. And Even if you think that we have an effective system of oversight and checks and balances at the federal level, what happens at the state and local level should scare you, because there is no effective oversight there. And when a single police officer in this country or in another country who may not make a whole lot of money has the capability to hack into any computer in the world, that really should terrify us. And these are the tools that are now being given to local cops. These are, and even in a country like India, if the police have to go to Google, Google can still say no. But when Hacking Team, who is apparently exhibiting their stuff in India right now, when they sell their stuff to the Indian authorities, you now have a single Indian police officer deciding whether a computer will be compromised or not. And I think this is too powerful a capability to be trusted to law enforcement.
So I'd like to see if Axel has any thoughts on that. And if you guys have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll call on you next.
Well, picking a bit up on what what Chris was saying, I thought what is so super fascinating about this German case is that they really go into the technical details and see how intrusive this is. And really even like the German federal police agency developed malware that was completely bogus, actually, could be subverted. Framing this discussion, and that's maybe something that Matt wants to react upon, but I'm really wondering whether framing this discussion as either there is wiretapping going on the infrastructure level, like in between at the ISP level, or at the endpoints where you break in. I think there's so many more options in the toolkit for doing law enforcement. And if we give this very intrusive, according to this German constitutional court, even more intrusive than the sanctuary of the home, right? If we give this tool to law enforcement, I both on like this constitutional level, which is more for the next debate, but let's debate here. Do we really entrust them, given the current status quo in like the technical capabilities of these agencies and the concrete cases in which we have seen that this was actually done in a way that could be subverted and actually weakened and also pose danger to actually law enforcement databases themselves? Is this the right moment to give these powers to law enforcement? I seriously doubt that. And I also think that any surveillance capabilities that you give to law enforcement will eventually turn out and will be perverted, actually. Both on the Dutch and in the German case, you could actually well see that these cases and these instances, only a bit of a nod towards law enforcement of having these capabilities, where we're not really sure whether they actually need them, is something that we have to be very, very careful about. And framing this discussion as, well, you have either infrastructure wiretaps or at the endpoint, where there's every day a new technology coming up that we can subvert. I'm really hesitant to take that step, even though, yeah. So that was. Yeah.
But let me just point out that if we succeed at, one of the things that a large element of the computer security, particularly the activist aspect of the computer security world, has been advocating is moving as much security into a sort of end-to-end model as possible. Yeah. And to a large extent, we've lost that battle in some ways and we've won that battle in other ways, right? But we've lost that battle, there's the cloud, right? There's all this stuff in Google and other providers, and that's available to anybody with the legal authority to ask for it. On the other hand, that pendulum can swing back in the other direction. If we succeed, the choice is ultimately going to be, if you want to have any surveillance at all, it's going to have to be pushed into the endpoint. And do we want to mandate surveillance capabilities, which I think would be a disaster, or do we want to force law enforcement, just as they do with when they want to search my home? I put the best lock on it that I can, and they figure out the best way to pick it they can, and there's a battle between us, and that's kind of what we settled on. I'm a lot more comfortable with that than something that says, no, law enforcement needs a little bit of mandated help here.
But this works remotely, right? So if, you know, Axel lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts right now, the only police who are going to show up at his house and break his lock are the local police or maybe the feds, the federal agency, but the police from a neighboring state are not going to come and kick down his door. Their jurisdiction doesn't extend that far. Certainly the police in a different country are not going to kick down his door. But what we're talking about here are tools that allow law enforcement to have global reach. And, you know, in some cases, they don't even know the destination before they hit the trigger. Right? They're really shooting through doors and not knowing who's standing on the other side, or even which country the other side of the door is. Actually, I guess more like shooting through a portal. But that's it. That raises some really scary issues. Like, you may be fine with the FBI hacking into any computer in the world, but maybe you're not okay with the Ethiopian government hacking into any computer in the world. The Ethiopian people probably think that their law enforcement is doing a great job. Although certainly the Ethiopians in DC probably don't think that. But every country has law enforcement, and should, you know, every police agency be given those powers?
Very short, concretely picking up on that. Since 2010, a couple of cases related to Tor have been at the Dutch level, and one of them was the biggest child abuse case in the Netherlands. So basically, the whole discussion about the Bredolab botnet was, you know, for like a couple of weeks was set aside because this had to be solved. Which, you know, it was really a serious issue, but on the other hand, yeah, what do you have the rule of law for, right? But what happened here was that the Dutch government hacked into the systems, and a very easy PHP exploit went into a couple of servers and made a query, HTTP query, to their own machine, and thus they could see not through Tor, but through the normal web, right? And they could see what IP address this was. It turned out that all these boxes were in the United States. Well, this was a particularly serious case, so they contacted the U.S. authorities, and the U.S. authorities were complicit. But if that's the way in which we can go about and figure out who is behind Tor hidden services, that's really something that we have to be very, very careful about. I mean, I'm very hesitant about this, especially given all the other opportunities we have, as was shown in the other Tor case that I talked about, of basically going undercover and you know, searching contact, and that's something that we both technically is not as problematic, and for which we already have these legal procedures. I'm just very careful to take that step.
So I think we're about out of time. But I think we're also going to raise some of these issues, particularly the international issue, in the legal panel that's coming up next. So, you know, I really appreciate y'all giving us a good overview of the technology, and I wish we had more time for debate, but this was, I think, very enlightening. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Careful, because the mic is still.
I hope nothing I'm saying is going out over the internet.
Margot, are we swapping them now, or is there a wait or coffee?
I wonder what your response would be to that last.
Yeah, I mean, I think
5 minutes, and then we'll come back.
all sorts of things because
Yeah.
they have guns, you know, and ultimately we shouldn't trust them with them, but we do. So how is this different?
Yeah, well, the scale is so different. The technology makes it possible to. That's of course the super difficult question of all stuff internet, right? Right.
Keeping it from scale is obviously
Very important. Yeah. Hey. Hey.
push these things when we talk or not?
No, I think as long as the light's green. I'm probably speaking into the. Okay. All right. All right, so I guess we're good to go, and the heat has come up a bit, so it's much more pleasant up here. Great, so before we get started on this second panel, which is about law and policy, I want to just make sure to give you guys a recap of a few key points from the first talk that I think will be important to inform our analysis here. I think Chris and Matt and Axel mentioned, for example, that it's good to keep in mind that there are different types of vulnerabilities. So from a policy perspective, I think that is something to be considered, whether you're just hacking into an individual's computer or you're doing something that is going to very likely have much larger, wider, more difficult to control the effects of it. There are also differences in types of access, whether you're getting a company to mediate something, whether you are simply hacking into the computer itself, you being law enforcement, obviously, and how you're doing that specifically, if you're just doing a phishing attempt or if there's something that comes across automatically that can be pushed out to the target, could potentially make a legal difference. And I'm curious to hear whether that's something that lawmakers and judges have thought about. And then two, I think really important points are related more to the international nature of computer hacking. One is that it's unclear, honestly, where in the world people are when they're your target. And I think this has a lot of effects that several people on the panel will talk about. And we've also faced, I think this is probably was Chris's biggest concern, there's sort of a trickle-down effect in that tools that were once the domain of intelligence agencies, very well-funded intelligence agencies like the NSA, are trickling down to local law enforcement, other countries, and so forth. They might not be able to have still all the tools that the NSA has right now, but there is kind of a democratization, as it were, of this technology. So I think those are some key points that, especially if you're less technical, the legal-minded folks in the audience might want to keep in mind. So with that in mind, I'll introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started on some brief comments and questions and discussions. So first to my left here, we have Magistrate Judge Stephen Smith from Texas. He's from the Southern District of Texas, my home state, and he has written a lot, unusually for a judge, about law enforcement hacking, and actually handed down an order denying an application for law enforcement hacking recently. He's one of the most technically savvy judges in the nation. We have Professor Laura Donahue, who's at Georgetown. She's director of their Center for National Security and the Law. And she writes about legal issues and emerging technologies, running the gamut from the type of hacking we're discussing here to things like drones and other sorts of technologies. Ahmed Ghapoor. He's an instructor at the National Security Clinic at UT Law, another semi-Texan now. And unusually, he's also an engineer, worked at Sun Microsystems, is that
Silicon
right?
Graphics.
Okay.
And Sun.
Yeah.
But okay.
But now in his life as a lawyer, he's worked on Guantanamo cases and national security cases. So it's an interesting background. Justin, all the way to my right, is a staffer for the Senate Homeland Security Committee. He's investigated federal spending on surveillance gear for local law enforcement. He wrote a terrific report on fusion centers a couple years ago that I suggest everyone check out. And finally, we have Stephanie Pell. leading up our all-star panel here. She was a former national security prosecutor at the DOJ. She was the lead in the Jose Padilla case. And now she writes more on the academic and consulting side, looking at security, has teamed up with Chris on some really interesting papers about these issues. So I think we'll let Judge Smith go first and take it from there.
All right, thank you, Jen. Last spring, I was sitting around my office with a stack of search warrants, kind of minding my own business, doing my job, and something rather unusual came across my desk. It was a request basically for the government to hack into a computer. This was, most of my business is fairly routine, and I've been doing this, I guess, 9 or 10 years now. This was a rather unusual request, and I thought, first thought, well, you know, maybe DOJ wants me to write an opinion on hacking warrants. I think after second thoughts, I thought probably, no, more likely this was a new prosecutor and hadn't been warned about me, and so it came to my desk. Now, this was the crime that they were investigating. I think it's useful to, after the discussion we've had in the first panel, to talk about a specific case. They were investigating, I guess, what I call a 21st century bank robbery. I mean, someone had gotten unauthorized access to an account holder's password, had used that access to get that account holder's access to their bank account, had authorized a couple of six-figure transfers to an offshore account somewhere in a foreign country. The account holder got wind of this, was a little obviously alarmed, took some steps. He changed his password and changed his email account. But whoever these people were, not to be deterred, decided to go set up a dummy email account that was very close in terms of address, letters. It was about a 26-letter number email address. It only varied by one number to the existing email account, and then tried again sending an email to the bank, trying to make another transfer, this time for 7 figures to some offshore account somewhere in Southeast Asia. The government wanted a warrant to install data extraction software and into this target computer. There were several aspects, a couple of different aspects of this request. They wanted to search for data in the computer, to retrieve a bunch of data in the computer regarding internet browsing history, search terms, emails, that sort of thing, chats, IM logs. They also wanted to monitor the computer over a 30-day period, and the essential thing they wanted to do while they monitored was to activate the webcam and take a picture of the person at the computer. And by that means, not only would they have facial identification, but they could get latitude, longitude coordinates and perhaps locate this individual in space. Again, the two problems that the FBI had here were they didn't know who these wrongdoers were, who the suspects were. It was the famous FNU, LNU. If you know, familiar with law enforcement lingo, that stands for first name unknown, last name unknown. Secondly, they didn't know where this computer was. The only evidence they had was an IP address that resolved somewhere in Southeast Asia. Okay, we don't have a rule of procedure or a statute yet that deals with the process for justifying or granting these type of hacking warrants. So the default rule that we use in this country is Rule 41, Rule of Criminal Procedure, that basically sets out the procedure for standard search warrants, or search warrants for the home or office, or arrest warrants and that sort of thing. The rule is basically technology neutral. Ordinarily, again, the warrants are issued as a matter of course. They take a regular form. It's a matter of ticking off the boxes. You got probable cause, yes. Where do you want to search? Yes, here's a description. Fill in the dates. Rather routine. This was not routine. The way I looked at it, and I'd be interested to hear the other comments of the people on the panel here who have great respect for, it seemed to me that this was at least a request for 2 searches and perhaps also a request for a seizure of documentation. First of all, they wanted to search for where this computer was that these bad guys were accessing to try to dip into this guy's account. They didn't know where this computer was. Could be anywhere in the world. The agent expressly told me, well, we got this IP address, but that doesn't mean anything. IP addresses can be spoofed. So they were searching for the computer. Then they would extract the information from the computer, which I think I didn't really say this in the opinion, but as I'm thinking about it afterwards, that's more a seizure of data. And then they're going to bring that data back, and an FBI agent in the Southern District of Texas then would sit at his laptop, review the data, search through it, and find out if there was anything pertaining to the crime. So you've got search of the computer, retrieval of the data, which is a seizure, and then a search once they get the data on their screen. I looked at that as basically having 3 problems. First of all, Rule 41 has territorial limits. Unlike other judges, I understand that they're Spanish judges who can invoke universal jurisdiction. We don't have that in our system. Federal judges are judges limited in jurisdiction where their warrant is good. And so this warrant had a problem because of the 5 alternative forms of territorial limits that Rule 41 provides. The only one that was invoked here was Rule 41B1, which authorizes a warrant to search for and seize a person or property within the district. Well, they were candid with me that they couldn't say at this time where this computer was, and they had no basis to assume that the computer itself was in the district. So that was the problem. Now, they argued to me that because they were going to review the data for the first time on a computer in our district, that would be enough to satisfy Rule 41. Well, that wasn't convincing to me because that didn't seem to address the first search and actually the seizure, which was trying to find the computer. So I found that there was no territorial jurisdiction for the search warrant. I went ahead and analyzed 2 other problems with the warrant that I thought it had, and that was one under the Fourth Amendment's particularity requirement. The Fourth Amendment says warrants must particularly describe the places to be searched, and basically this is the provision that prohibits general search warrants. That was the impetus for the Fourth Amendment to begin with. This search warrant seemed to me, based on the information that was provided, to be a very general search warrant. It was kind of like a warrant to search an apartment building that had 100 different apartments, and you think, well, there's something of interest in one of those apartments, we don't know which, so let us search all those 100 apartments. Well, that's not the way Rule 41 works. And here, because they had no clue where this computer was, they couldn't say what country it was in. They couldn't assure me that in order to find that computer, whatever technique they used, they weren't going to infect or go through other innocent computers that didn't have anything to do with the crime. In my view, the particularity requirement was not satisfied there. The final problem that I identified was the issue with regard to video surveillance. Video surveillance, again, is another topic that's not expressly dealt with in the rules, but by analogy, at least in our circuit, in order to get a warrant to justify ongoing video surveillance, the requirements of the Wiretap Act have been kind of imported as a matter of case law, that there has to be some minimization, has to rule out inadequate alternatives, also has to be reasonable in terms of the duration of the surveillance. This application struck me again as problematic with regard to minimization as well as the inadequate alternatives. I got vague assurances from the government that they were only going to be able to get the malware or the data extraction software inserted on the target computer, but they didn't explain to me why. And I have to take issue with something that Jen said in my introduction. I am not the most tech-savvy person in the judiciary. I am very lacking in that area. But so I wasn't asking for people to show me the computer code. I just wanted some assurance that what they were going to do was not going to infect a bunch of computers of innocent people throughout the country, if not the world. I didn't get that assurance. Finally, with regard to the inadequate alternatives, which is what Title III wiretap would require and what video surveillance requires in our circuit, the idea was that I was assured that, well, this is the only means we're going to be able to have in order to locate this computer and these people. Well, that contradicted another application I had on the very same case that same day, where they were asking for a 2703D order to go to Google to get information about these email accounts. The statements in those applications were, well, we need this information in order to be able to locate, this is necessary to locate this target. So they hadn't actually exhausted that alternative either. So that's basically the case that I had, very interesting case. I took some time to write it up because I thought it was worthwhile. And hopefully that'll kind of tee off the discussion here, and I'll step down for now.
Great, thanks. I think Laura's up next, and I'd just like to say, if you know a judge who knows more about technology than you do, I'd like to meet them. So, yeah, putting that out there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to do three things here. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about why it's so hard to talk about this subject in the context of legal authorities and the way it's working its way through the courts. Second, I'd like to talk about what we do know about how it's being used. And third, I'd like to then move into the Fourth Amendment questions that present. So on the first point, it is very hard to do any systematic study of this phenomenon. Since this article first came out that Craig Timberg wrote in December, I've made a concerted effort actually to find out a lot more about how this is actually working in practice. And what I have found is a number of problems. First of all, this technique has various names. So it's known alternately in the legal documents and in the press as a port reader, as a harvesting program, as a CPAV, which is a computer and internet protocol address verifier, or as an IPAV, an internet protocol address verifier. It's known as network investigative techniques, or NIT, as data extraction software, as it was in the documents that Judge Smith referred to, as remote searches, as harvesting programs, and so on. So any effort to try to find information about this depends on various types of searches and search terms and efforts to get a handle on what are often different aspects. It's the elephant problem, right, of the same problem, the same bigger phenomenon. An additional problem here is that the record systems, if this is coming to magistrate judges, and many magistrates have not been on an electronic filing system until very recently. This just takes a lot of old-fashioned work going around and looking through legal ledgers to try to find in the clerk's office these documents. Many of them, moreover, are sealed, and they're sealed indefinitely, many of these documents, and you have to know about the documents in order to ask for them to be unsealed. But even that is fraught with difficulty from a legal perspective, because as a lawyer, if you want to actually make a motion to unseal the document, you have to be admitted pro hac vice in that particular district, in that particular area, but we do have 50 states, which makes it hard to be admitted and very expensive to be admitted to each one of them. You could make a FOIA request, right, to do this, but the problem with that is there's an exemption for law enforcement for any investigative techniques, as well as for national security, which appear to be the two ways in which this is being used. In addition, you have tight controls that are being imposed from the FBI and from the Department of Justice in Washington, and efforts to unseal it, even if you're successful in being admitted pro hac vice, for instance, in a district and requesting, you know about the record, which is a big if, and you request to unseal it, then both common law doctrine and Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, they weigh a balancing of interest between the individual, the government, and the public interest, and these often come out firmly weighted towards law enforcement in protecting new or emerging investigative techniques. So there are an enormous number of problems in trying to get the information. So what do we know? Well, I'll move to the second part here. So far, a lot of what we know is anecdotal, and it's anecdotal in the sense that it's not methodologically developed state by state, but there are dozens of cases that I have found where there have been requests put in for this. In 2002, we know that iPads were being used then. In October 2004, there's a Ninth Circuit case. In November 2004, we know Yakima, Washington. March 2006, there was one in San Diego. In May of 2006, there was another one. It's not known where that was. June of 2007 in Lacey, Washington. August 2007 in Denver. Then we have some cases in New York in July and August. In April 2013, we have Houston, Texas. We have Austin, Texas. There are many more. And the way we know this is through a combination of public record and FOIA requests that have been made, and reading between the lines in these FOIA requests, there are apparently many more of these applications being done. Now, how is it being accessed in terms of its exercise? This was a question that Chris raised in the first panel, that this is one of the most interesting questions. That's unclear. So we know, for instance, the MySpace case in Timberline, dealing with Timberline High School. This was in Washington, near Seattle and Lacey, Washington. And we also know that IPAV and related tools are being used, but often these applications do not include detailed technology or technological information as to how it's actually going to be executed, enter the computer, exactly what information is going to be obtained, which other devices may be infected, how many devices may be infected, and so on. Now, what about who is accessing this information? Well, we know, for instance, that the FBI does it, but it's not just one unit in the FBI. There are about 4 or 5 different parts of the FBI that appear to be developing concurrent tools and developing standards to go with each of these tools that accomplish similar aims. The Joint Terrorism Task Forces appear to be using these. Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. ATF has also actually submitted warrants for this. We assume that the NSA, because also FISA is employed in this regard, but it's possible that there are other law enforcement agencies federally that are also using these authorities. If you go through the various users of Title III of Pen Register, Trap and Trace, of the Stored Communications Act, the ECPA, those who are subject to those who might use FISA, then there might be many other agencies. So we have to be careful about what question we ask, which is who is actually applying for these warrants. Now, what is being obtained? I'd like to give you 2 examples just to give you an idea of the breadth of material. One case is taken from Colorado. Now, this particular Colorado case dealt with Andrew Ryan. Somebody identified himself as Andrew Ryan, later called himself Mo for Mohammed, who was trying to free somebody named James Holmes, who was the suspect at the time in the Aurora Theater shooting. Now, the actual application in this instance asked for the computer's IP address, the computer's MAC address as well, which is the media access control, or MAC for the MAC address. From the network interface card, the computer's open communication ports, a list of all the programs running on the computer, the type of operating system that was running on the computer, the web browser and the version that was running of the web browser on the computer, language encoding and default language, the computer's time zone information, the registered computer name, the registered company name as well for that computing device. They wanted to know the logged in username, list of user accounts, the times that they were on the computer, as well as the uniform resource locator, that the URL, of course, to which the target computer was previously connected. And then there was a catch-all, which really caught my eye in this particular application, which is other similarly identifying information on the activating computer that may assist in identifying the computer, its location, Other information about the computer and the user of the computer may be accessed by NIT. So as an academic that frequently uses track changes in Word where everybody's name pops up whenever they edit a Word document, I thought, well, that would probably be a fairly clear indicator of who's using the computer. In fact, various files on that computer might be used as part of the NIT. Now, similarly, for Judge Smith's application, they were looking at collecting a fair amount of information. The records to be installed included records of IP addresses used, the internet activity, firewall logs, caches, browser history and cookies, bookmarked or favorite web pages, search terms that the user entered into any internet search engine, and records of user-typed web addresses, records evidencing the use of internet protocol addresses, evidence of who owned or controlled the target computer at the time the things described in the warrant were created, edited, or deleted. This is a huge amount of information that's being obtained on these computers themselves, as well as user profiles, browser history, email contents, email contacts, chat, messaging logs, photographs, correspondence, evidence of software that would allow others to use that target computer, and evidence of the time that the target computer was used, a record of all applications run. And this is aside from the camera and the tracking using the photography on the computer itself. Okay, now what this should immediately do is move to the final part of my remarks, which is the Fourth Amendment issues, because these obviously raise very concerning Fourth Amendment concerns. First and foremost is this question of particularity. As Judge Smith mentioned, particularly describing the persons or things to be searched. This is the basic tenet of the Fourth Amendment itself. Now, these are particular in that they're describing everything on a computer, but in criminal law, you have to look at the nexus between the crime that's being alleged and those documents. And the fact that it happens to be on the computer is not a sufficient nexus under the Fourth Amendment, I would suggest, to say that everything on that computer can then be collected and analyzed. And I think one of the problems is that is precisely this general warrant question. You know, we have a long history in the country of rejecting general warrants as a way to find out who a criminal is. But in many of these cases, this FNU, LNU issue, they're using information to find the criminal and to find evidence of criminality for that individual. And this is backwards, right? You know, the way we think of the Fourth Amendment is you know who the person is, and then you go after the evidence to support that this person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime. And what's going on in this case is very similar to what happened in Entick versus Carrington, which is the paradigmatic case from England in 1762, when King George III's messengers basically broke into somebody's home to execute a warrant issued by the Secretary of State. Now, two aspects in this case proved particularly troubling for the first Earl of Camden at the time he was Chief Justice. First of all, that the writ had empowered the Crown to seize all documents, not just those of a criminal nature. That was a problem. And second, that no demonstration had been made prior to the search and seizure establishing the probability that Entick himself was engaged in criminal activity. Now, the court at the time saw that as the aggrandizement of too much power, something that had been rejected with the beheading of Charles I, again in the Glorious Revolution and the restoration of William and Mary to the throne. And so the Chief Justice concluded, we can safely say that there is no law in this country to justify the defendants in what they have done. If there was, it would destroy all the comforts of society, for papers are often the dearest property a man can have. Now, in the American colonies, it was a different story. As early as 1660, Westminster actually passed legislation allowing for general warrants in the colonies. Indeed, this became one of the major grievances of the colonists that led to the founding of this country. The most famous case here is Paxton's case, in which James Otis famously declared that that these writs are contrary to the, quote, fundamental principles of law. basically scholars look to Otis's oration as one of the great moments in U.S. history. John Adams, who was there, said, then and there the child liberty was born. Then and there. That for Otis, this writ was the worst instrument of arbitrary power. And so it came to be seen as precisely what we mean by the Fourth Amendment. That was the definition of an unreasonable search and seizure, the idea that you would have a general warrant that followed. So the Virginia Constitutional Convention adopted the Virginia Declaration of Rights, in which it rejected the concept of a general warrant. In fact, it was only on the grounds that a Bill of Rights incorporate a rejection of general warrants that Virginia and New York are arguably the two most important states to adopt the new Constitution in 1787, that was arguably the most important states hinged it on rejecting the idea of a general warrant. And so we find in this case that what we're seeing is basically a general warrant to collect everything on the computer in order to find who the criminal is and evidence of that individual's wrongdoing. In addition, what we're seeing here is a combination of electronic tracking, electronic intercepts, and content without it being separated out, and an ongoing search warrant. So a search warrant is executed when an individual enters a home. Once that search warrant is executed, that individual leaves the home. This is an ongoing search in many instances where, not in all, but in many of these warrants, what appears to be requested is that they be able to go into the computer and on an ongoing basis download information and collect information from that individual. There is confusion over exactly when the warrant has to be executed as well. So one of the problems with malware is that you don't know when that individual might log back onto their computer. And so there is a tendency for these warrants to want to push the timeline out either to a 30-day window or 30 days from when an individual actually logs onto the computer. This is very different than our typical 10-day search warrant to go into somebody's home, that if you don't do it after 10 days, then you've lost the opportunity to do that. We also see there are two more Fourth Amendment issues I'll just briefly touch on. One is the seizure question, whether this is a seizure of an individual's papers. And here in 1984, we have the case Jacobson, where the court says that a seizure of property occurs when there's some meaningful interference with an individual's possessory interest in that property. And I think here this is a harder case to make in some ways because you're making a copy of that individual's property. But I think that it is not without merit to say that you are being deprived of a privacy possessory interest in that property itself. The third general Fourth Amendment point that I'll make and end with is this effects point. So obviously in the Fourth Amendment it's one's papers and effects were understood at the time of the founding as letters and sealed packages, but also intangible property like bank records. And the reason why is because this reached into an individual's privacy sphere. And I think there's also an effects argument that could be raised with regard to the intangible properties that are at issue in this case.
Thanks so much. Amanda, I think you're next.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professor Donahue and Judge Smith. I'm just going to keep this short, about 4 minutes, and mostly focusing on international issues that have to do with malware searches. But before I do that, I just want to talk about one issue related to the two separate searches that Judge Smith was talking about. And specifically, that first search to me represents the deployment of the malware program. And usually, or at least every application that I've seen, that deployment happens through a phishing attack. So even before we get into the analysis of Fourth Amendment issues, you basically have an email being sent to somebody, and the focus is to search a computer. But in this case, the case that Professor Donahue was talking about was Mo, right? And Mo was supposedly in Iran. And, but the problem is Mo could have checked his email on someone else's computer. And to the extent he checked it on someone else's computer, you've got an innocent neutral bystander who's just been violated, or there's been an intrusion. Just something to note. Moving on to the international issue, which is the second step of the search, or the way I would look at it. I'm sorry, the first step of the search, where you're still on the deployment stage. As a threshold matter, it's important to note that the Fourth Amendment has a limited application abroad, which means necessarily that for a U.S. citizen there is no warrant requirement, and for a foreign national there's actually no privacy right unless you can establish sufficient contacts with the United States. Otherwise, because there's no warrant requirement, or you're not subject to that requirement, you're basically governed by the reasonableness standard, for which there is a dearth of case law, and it's very fuzzy grounds. That's especially problematic because there is no statutory or constitutional basis authorizing a federal or state judge to issue a warrant that has an actual extraterritorial application. So basically, any warrant that would issue or allow a search abroad would be a deficient warrant. Taking those 2 points together, on the one hand, you've got no authority to issue a foreign warrant, and on the other hand, you've got a standard of reasonableness for U.S. citizens that might be abroad or others that can demonstrate contacts. You've got an interesting set of circumstances where you've got a law enforcement investigation and a situation that's not exigent or not demonstrably exigent, no necessary public safety concern, and you've got targets that have potentially some form of privacy right as governed by this reasonableness standard. And on the other hand, you've got no valid ex ante authorization for the search. In other words, the search does not get authorized, or any authorization of a foreign search wouldn't be valid. So you've got no real scrutiny as to that. So the problem that set of circumstances sort of establishes is the lack of remedy. Or it's especially sort of underscored when you think about the remedy, which is to say, let's say Mo is actually a U.S. citizen. So I think it was actually the Timberline case where they thought the target was in Italy and he wound up being in Washington State. But let's say Mo is actually a U.S. citizen that's actually in Iran, and the malware works and it searches his computer and you've got that evidence. That evidence or that acquisition, that search is governed by a reasonableness standard. And so Mo now is being tried in the United States and he wants to suppress that evidence. The officer that sees that evidence would say, well, I was relying on a warrant, and the warrant said that I could search Mo's computer, and if it's deficient, then it's deficient, but it's not my fault. And it's therefore not subject to the exclusionary rule. And it probably wouldn't be. And so you would basically have no recourse in the context of a criminal case. And similarly, if you were trying to assert a Bivens claim afterwards, the defective warrant, in addition to the fact that there's a dearth of case law on the issue, would also go towards a qualified immunity defense for agents and prosecutors and so on. So, just so we can move on to the discussion, I just want to underscore a couple more issues that sort of tie into the international context. The first is pointing out that off-the-shelf privacy tools that are open source can give anyone sitting in this room on their laptop an appearance of being in a foreign country. So if I was tracking you and you were actually sitting here in New Haven, I could think that you're in Germany or Netherlands or so on. And that sort of touches on the interest or the policy interest of wanting warrant applications to actually state accurate facts. The second issue is, or the second thing I want to point out is that the procedural vacuum that results that I just explained basically, due to the lack of jurisdiction on the courts, basically creates a situation where domestic law enforcement has the ability to infringe on another sovereign. And that's especially problematic in an era of cyber war, and in an era where you don't know what you're hacking into. So it might be the critical infrastructure of the Irani cyber naval force or something like that. And it's not just about the moral high ground to hack back, it's about actually potentially starting or being perceived as issuing or hostility in the context of the law of war. And then finally, as for parallel construction, there's an actual formal process for getting data that's located overseas. And that has to do with the mutual legal assistance treaties, mutual legal assistance agreements. And what's interesting is that when you look through the literature, the DOJ literature, it actually says, you're supposed to do this, and so pursue X, Y, and Z steps. But because it takes so much time, you might actually want to deploy or pursue informal techniques, informal network investigative techniques, basically, which to me sounds like hacking. So essentially what's being encouraged here is, on the one hand, getting utilizing diplomatic measures to get evidence that's usable in court, and on the other hand, just to continue a hot investigation utilizing something like a hack or a malware search. And so what ends up happening is, when you get to trial, or when that's actually used in court under any circumstance, you're actually using the evidence that you've received through the MLAT process. And the hack or the deployment of malware, the malware search, forever stays hidden, which is quite an interesting concept, basically. Yeah.
Thanks. So I think our last two speakers are going to focus on policy issues. We're going to move away from the legal technicalities a little bit. And I guess, Stephanie, do you want to go first? And then we'll wrap up with Justin.
Good afternoon. What I'd like to suggest is that these law enforcement hacking techniques are part of a progression of law enforcement surveillance tools that are stretching the bounds of statutory language and escaping timely congressional oversight. So clearly, as Judge Smith and other panelists have identified, there may be a very large and challenging Fourth Amendment problem. And perhaps that problem could be addressed by the courts. Perhaps Congress could write new language to Rule 41 if Congress determined that, in fact, these sorts of law enforcement surveillance techniques should be authorized. But for Congress to make those kinds of determinations, Congress first has to know what's going on. It's very difficult for Congress to regulate what it cannot see. And so, as I started out saying, I believe that some of these techniques, at least, are part of a progression of techniques that are escaping congressional oversight. I'd like to raise an earlier technique that Chris Soghoian mentioned, something called the Stingray, which is essentially a surveillance device which masquerades as a cell tower and tricks your cell phone into communicating with the Stingray device as if it was AT&T and Verizon. And when your phone communicates with AT&T and Verizon, it transmits all sorts of information, all sorts of metadata, even content, as we all know. And your location can be determined from the transmission of this data. As Chris Soghoian previously said, this is a direct, unmediated technique. When law enforcement uses a Stingray, it does not have to go to Verizon or AT&T to get the information that it would otherwise get if it wanted location data or it was implementing a wiretap to get content communications. So when this happens, on the one hand, you create a situation where there is, as Chris mentioned, no third party. A lot of times, privacy scholars have documented how so much of our data is held by a third party, and therefore we lose constitutional protections. But one of arguably the benefits of the third party, a third party having your data, is, at least in some circumstances, there's the ability to be a mediator, to push back and say, you know what, I don't believe, Mr. Law Enforcement Agent, that you have given me the appropriate legal process. When the government is accessing information directly without any third-party mediator, it is if it is doing this invisibly. And if Congress can't see it, it can't regulate it. Let me add then an additional layer or problem that occurs when we talk about this in the law enforcement hacking context. As the first panel and some of our last speaker just mentioned, there are some significant security vulnerabilities, not just to the individual who is being hacked, but to others. So that, and I'll borrow Professor Blaze's words, if the lesser evil is figuring out how to manage these targeted tools, then we have to be able to regulate them. Are we going to permit law enforcement only to use techniques that target end devices, our cell phones, our tablets, or if they are using techniques that are essentially taking advantage of vulnerabilities in larger infrastructure or networks, those present different types of security problems. So that again, while courts, and I'm not suggesting that there is even a perfect or a reasonable method of judicial review for some of these issues now, because a lot of times, as Professor Donahue has pointed out, and Magistrate Smith, he writes like a professor, so has written about in some scholarship, these types of orders remain sealed as a matter of default. And it's rare that we get enough of a sample of them to start sort of being able to draw conclusions and make broader arguments. So to kind of wrap up opening remarks, what I would suggest is that while we should very much be concerned about the Fourth Amendment issues that are raised by government hacking, I'm at least even more concerned about the greater security policy issues that some of these surveillance techniques are raising that are not being addressed, and that, frankly, courts will have difficulties addressing even if, over time, courts see more and more of these types of applications.
Great. I think we'll wrap
All
up
right.
with Justin
I'll
with
keep
some
it
insights into how Congress is dealing with
Okay, all right, I'll do my best. My name is Justin Root, and I work doing oversight from the Senate Homeland Security Committee. Most of my work over the last few years has focused on domestic intelligence and surveillance, and particularly capabilities that are being shared or enhanced at the state and local level by federal programs and funding. And recently I've been looking at the use of federal funds, federal grant funds that are going to state and local agencies to purchase some of these sophisticated, oftentimes covert surveillance technologies. I've focused more on the stingrays and license plate readers and some of the other kind of larger ticket hard technologies, and less on the techniques for a couple reasons. The main one being that the federal government's system of tracking what their grant money gets spent on is so bad that unless it's really expensive, they probably don't have a record of it. And that I think that those are also the technologies that you've seen spread the most, and there's been some good coverage recently. I think USA Today did a really wonderful piece looking at how stingrays are increasingly being adopted by state and local police organizations. Very, very briefly, I'll just walk through the grant process. It's one of the least interesting corners of the federal government, so I'll try to make this as short and interesting as possible. FEMA hands out disaster grants. When things go bad, FEMA shows up and helps, but they also hand out non-disaster grants called preparedness grants. And the purpose of the preparedness grants are to help state and local governments prepare for, mitigate, and respond to, and prevent, if possible, terrorist attacks using weapons of mass destruction and cyber attacks. They have a pot of money between $700 million and $1 billion a year that they hand out. Unlike grants that I'm sure many of you at one point or other have competed for, these are not competitive grants. These are magical grants in which the government decides how much money you're going to get before you even tell them what you're going to spend it on. And then you backfill and say, oh, well, if you're giving me $140 million, this is what I'd probably do with it. And then the government says, that looks great, here's a check. And then from there, it's kind of off to the races. There's very little oversight on that process on the back end. So once the money's out the door, the focus is on getting the money out the door to the states and locals. Once the money gets spent, and then making sure that it gets spent. What it gets spent on, whether that equipment gets used, how it gets used, is not a concern of the federal government, or of FEMA, I should say. And as a result, you see a spread of a lot of these technologies that there are, I think, very serious open questions about how their use, in what cases their use is appropriate and how their use is appropriate. FEMA uses something called the Authorized Equipment List, which is a very boring-sounding document with a lot of very exciting-sounding categories. They have 713 subcategories, and the basic function of the Authorized Equipment List is if you use this, or if you tell us that you're buying off of this list, then we probably won't hassle you about anything. The Authorized Equipment List includes a category called Equipment Law Enforcement Surveillance, and their definition of what's allowable under the grant program is surveillance equipment and related accessories, including but not limited to audio, data, and visual equipment, and full stop. And then they go into some slightly more detail, although surveillance equipment, including but not limited to audio, data, and visual, covers more or less the full universe of what you're going to be conducting surveillance with or on. They do note at the end it also includes equipment designed to extract information from personal digital assistants and cellular devices, such as cellular phones and messaging devices. And so that basically is a category that they say if you're going to spend money and you say it's pursuant to the subcategory, that's totally okay with us. There are some people who are asking questions about how appropriate it is to have that category because because it's a preparedness grant program focused on terrorism or counterterrorism, and the role of the state and local law enforcement in terrorism investigations is somewhat limited and typically in a secondary position to the FBI and federal agencies that already have, as we've seen and talked about extensively, really great tools of their own. So that's a basic overview of the funding process of how this winds up in the hands of state and local law enforcement.
Great. Thanks. So I think we've got a reasonable amount of time, about 20, 25 minutes for questions. So I have a couple questions of my own, and I'm going to take my moderator's prerogative and ask those first. But if you guys have any questions at all, just raise your hand, and I'll make sure to get to you. So there's so many things I'm interested in with this panel, and I'm not sure exactly where to start, but I will, I think, first off, talk about the issue of particularity, which several of you discussed. And to play devil's advocate, since I think this panel is kind of stacked with, Chris chose the folks on this panel. I did invite someone from the Department of Justice. Okay. And he said, thank you very much for the invitation, but we will not be coming. I see. All right. Well, you know, there are people out there who have raised criticisms about, you know, Judge Smith's decision. Sorry to be, yeah. So I was just looking up one of them now who pointed out, Orrin Kerr, who is not with us, who pointed out that in other warrants, you know, the investigators don't actually need to explain every single detail of what they were doing. So if they're installing a bug in somebody's room, they don't have to explain, at least in the case that he pointed out, you know, the covert operation that they're going through to install this. So as a layperson, I'm confused by the difference between that sort of argument where you can put in a bug and you know, how it gets in there, you can kind of assume that they're going to have to get into the house and put it in there somehow. And this situation where it seems that what the panelists here are saying are that judges really need to have a lot more technical knowledge and receive much more technical explanations than they're currently receiving. And I'm curious what you all see as the differences there and why such particularity is so important for this issue specifically.
Well, yeah, I have great respect for Professor Kerr. With regard to particularity here, though, again, I'm not asking, and I wouldn't demand that, and it would be lost on me for them to come in and explain all the ins and outs of the code and how their software is going to work and how it's particularly going to get to the target. But here, I wasn't given anything approaching that at all. I wasn't given anything other than, seemed to me, just what was the equivalent of an address of an apartment building, that somewhere there is a computer, and as was pointed out, it may not be the original computer that the email was sent on. It may be, they may be accessing it from another device. It may be a computer sitting in a law school library. It may be a computer sitting in an internet cafe somewhere. Maybe somebody's work computer that a lot of people have access to. I wasn't given any assurances or explanations as to how their technique was not going to perhaps go through or draw in other innocent computers or infect other innocent computers. I was just given a conclusory statement. That seemed to me just to be the equivalent of giving me an address of an apartment building. And so, again, I will protest. I am not technically savvy. It would all be over my head. You know, in order for us to really evaluate those, all of us would have to have Matt Blaze sitting in our office every time one of these warrant applications came in to be able to explain. And in all fairness, I mean, I do go back to the agents if I have questions. But again, their level of expertise is not always much greater than mine. So, with all due respect, I don't mean to cast aspersions, but they have a job to do, and they're not all computer specialists either. So, that would be my initial response.
So I would add to that. So first of all, we don't know the full context because it depends on each warrant, exactly what's being. So that's an important proviso. You don't know exactly what's being asked until you look at a particular case in front of you. At the most general level, though, I would offer 4 differences here. The first is this multiple computers point, which Judge Smith is drawing, that once you put this virus out there, it's unclear how many computers may be affected by this. And concurrent with that is it's unclear how many users may be affected by this. So if you're led to a computer in the library, it might be every user that has used that library computer whose private information is then being collected. And we're not seeing adequate minimization measures that might be introduced here that would address these types of questions, which is, you know, if we collect, 300 users' information, how are we going to minimize this information? Exactly what's going to be done at that end. Second, we're seeing this idea that they're seizing everything. So when you place an electronic bug, you are intercepting conversations. You're not also opening the file drawers. You're not also looking under the bed. You're not also going into private correspondence that might be located in another room. You're not going into their bank account at the local bank and looking at, you're actually doing one thing. You're intercepting that conversation. Here you're getting everything, and I think that's an important distinction to draw. So you have multiple computers, you have multiple people, and you're seizing everything. That's very different than placing a bug in a predetermined location. You also have the combination of all of this together creates a different privacy interest. So you would expect a different standard to be applied. And then the final point I would draw here comes back to Christopher's point in the first panel, which is exactly how this information is being accessed. Is it the case of the social network analysis type thing where it's a phishing attack, a spear phishing, where the target has to actually take some affirmative action that creates a vulnerability that you're then exploiting? Or are they accessing it via a third party, where they're placing a server, or in a server, you're placing a particular device that then transmits this information to the individual as soon as they log in? Or are you doing it through deceptive practices, that is posing as a third-party provider with a software update? You know, is this the position that the government is putting itself in to do this? Or are they directly accessing it like the not spearfishing, but stingray type incidents, where they're actually just collecting the information outright? And all of this is relevant for Fourth Amendment purposes if you're going to understand any of the privacy rights and the protections built around them with regard to private data held on electronic devices.
You know, it's interesting to me how this legal particularity argument seems, in fact, related to the secrecy argument that I think Stephanie and a couple other people have brought up. It seems tough to really have enough knowledge by the judiciary to evaluate this if these cases are remaining sealed and so forth. I'm curious, maybe start with Stephanie. I mean, how do we get around this issue of lawmakers and judges, first of all, not necessarily having the technical grounding to make these decisions, and then applications not being specific and everything being kind of kept secret for law enforcement reasons? Is there a way around that?
I think, you know, putting on the former prosecutor hat now, there's always going to be a tendency when law enforcement has a technique that they are going to want to keep it secret. I don't mean necessarily even classified, although sometimes classified, because when it is revealed or disclosed publicly, it's less likely to work next time. That being said, you know, some judges, like Judge Smith, another one we know, Judge Owsley, who wrote an opinion about the stingray, question prosecutors and agents about what they're being asked to authorize. I mean, part of the problem is sometimes these applications come, I think, Judge Smith, I won't put words in your mouth, I mean, you had a sense of what the government was asking you to authorize in this case, in the hacking case, but that's not always the case. At a larger level, here is a suggestion that is, you know, some may say, what, another report, but we have seen the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board recently write a report on Section 215 and the reform of the FISA courts. Right now, their jurisdiction, as mandated by the statute that created them, essentially focuses their efforts on intelligence programs and techniques affecting national security. That could certainly spill into law enforcement, but clearly here where we're talking, as Judge Smith raised, about a case that was a 21st century bank robbery. If the PCLOB or a board like the PCLOB was given the authority to essentially figure out what are the new and emerging or current law enforcement techniques that are going on, that are perhaps stretching the bounds of existing statutory languages, I would argue the Stingray is doing, because as far as I know, for the most part, the government is getting pen trap orders to authorize stingrays. If it could do that kind of investigation, talk to judges, the agencies, all security experts, et cetera, and then help put Congress, and because it would be a public report, perhaps with non-public appendix, but help put all of the branches of government in charge of playing some kind of regulatory role, educate them. I think that's a start.
So I'd like to express some skepticism about this. So you have one of the problems in this realm, which might not be as consistent with Stingray, but certainly in this realm, is that it's being done both through FISA and through regular criminal statutes. So you have Section 402, pen register, trap and trace under FISA. You also have the electronic intercepts under 50 U.S.C. 1801 to 1811. But then on the criminal side, you've got Title 3, 18 U.S.C. 2510 at SEC, and then you've got the pen register, trap and trace, which is 3121 and following. So what happens is, in fact, I found in the FOIA evidence which EFF obtained about CPAVs right here, that the problem is that once they start asking and magistrate judges start denying or questioning, then you see this dialogue, well, we should have just forgotten it and gone with FISA. Like, why did we even bother, right? So, okay, so say it's driven into a FISA realm, right? Then you have a classified realm, and those bodies as well cannot reveal classified information. So right now, we have a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and the President's speech on January 17th said he'd like there to be a panel of individuals to represent privacy interests, what that looks like, exactly what role they're going to play, whether there's going to be adversarial counsel, exactly. I mean, all of that is unclear. But what has certainly not been assigned to Fisk is a technology expert, a meaningful role, as far as I can tell, in terms of the privacy interest, or a method for the declassification of important information like this. So there is very little indication in my mind, first of all, that you wouldn't first see a shift over from the criminal realm to the FISA realm. And then once we move into the FISA realm, the ability to classify and keep that secret is much higher than you would see in just even the sealing and unsealing questions that attach to criminal issues. So I am somewhat skeptical of that as a solution for trying to figure out how these technologies are being actually deployed and used in a way, and to ensure that they're done in a way that's compatible with Fourth Amendment. I would see an advocate, for instance, at Fisk, whose job it is to represent that, to be a much more meaningful way to actually provide that check.
I see. Yeah, sure.
And I agree with like 95% of what you said. I will say, for example, in a bank robbery case, putting something into the FISA realm makes it more challenging. It does happen. I've prosecuted a case with mostly FISA evidence, but it does make it more complicated to bring it back. In other words, if you are a prosecutor working on bank robberies or identity theft, not sort of national security slated casework, you're not going to want to push it into the FISA realm, nor is, I think, the FBI or the National Security Division want to go that way either. They don't like to have to reveal sensitive FISA techniques in a criminal investigation. But if you're working on national security cases, I certainly could see that happening.
So Justin, do you think there's an appetite for fixing this situation in Congress, or what are your thoughts from working
well, yeah, I was going to jump in also and just say that we're also looking at the use of these technologies, at the state and local level, which is kind of keeps it within the criminal realm. And slightly more discoverable by interested parties in certain locations, like Congress. Is there an appetite? I mean, it's a public institution, so you can see as well as I can. I think that I wanted to respond to what Stephanie was saying. I think that Congress is this really fantastic oversight mechanism with amazingly broad powers to find out anything it wants if it has the inclination to ask the question and to insist on a response. There are very few people who can refuse to answer a question from Congress. And so that would be a great place to start to I think, start digging into some of these questions.
Go ahead. Then
I still don't understand how judges in districts that are patent docket heavy districts have technical clerks and go and essentially have seminars on technology and how to try a patent case and the mechanics of a patent case or semiconductor technology, yet we can't get together maybe during the judicial conferences some technical help, at least for so judges know what questions to ask. So it's not just Magistrate Smith.
Yeah. I will say that we do have very talented technical IT staff available to the courts, available to in managing our dockets, and I think we need to make better use of them. One thing that a point has been made repeatedly, and I wholeheartedly agree with, Congress can't regulate what it can't see. Congress has, you're right, great powers to investigate, but the problem is if the court is routinely sealing these documents, sealing these records, and putting them on docket sheets with the only entry being in re sealed case, nobody knows. In fact, the courts don't know. In fact, it's difficult for me to find out what's going on in another district if the case is sealed. It's very difficult. And we need a better system to capture that information. And I have proposed, and this is an idea that hasn't gotten anywhere yet, but in terms of, it seems to me a partial way to deal with the problem, to at least let Congress know what the courts are doing, is to institute a program in our docket system on the criminal side like we have on the civil side. Every civil case that's filed in federal court is instituted with a civil docket sheet. Basic information about the case, who the parties are, what the jurisdiction is, what the case is about, what the demand is, basic information about the case. We don't have that on the criminal side. I've suggested in an article that I published a couple of years ago that we ought to have a warrant cover sheet to cover this aspect of the federal court's docket. That just, it doesn't, I mean, obviously, I don't think anyone would want to publicly reveal a wiretap or an ongoing electronic surveillance order while a criminal case is ongoing. That's, you know, we don't want criminals to flee. We don't want evidence to be destroyed. But after the case is over, I've contended that there's no longer any justification for keeping everything secret. Now, you want to withhold the names of confidential informants, yeah, redact that information, fine. But I think there's a way, and I've toyed with the idea of myself of when a warrant application comes in to list, describe the type of warrant they're asking for, who the governmental agency is that's asking for it, what crime they're investigating, whether they want it sealed or whether it can just be redacted, how long, what the term of the sealing ought to be, basic information that's available to the public and therefore to Congress or the researchers who really want to find out, well, how many of these orders involving CPAVs are being issued or requested. That way, Congress is in a position to legislate. And that way, judges are, we're basically crying for authority. Tell us what we need to do. Tell us what the law is. If Congress is not able to do their job well, we're not able to do ours well. We're floundering in the dark, and that's so a lot of what I'm writing is really kind of a cry in the darkness, so to speak. Just tell us. I mean, I'm begging the government to appeal me. I realize I'm fallible and I'm making the wrong calls all over the place probably, but and of course they took me up on that recently, and that's fine. And we get guidance that way, but. Unless we as courts are really more forthcoming, it makes the job for everybody more difficult.
So I think I saw a hand up as anybody?
I'm sorry?
Question?
Clementis and dessert.
Yeah.
have some amount of legitimacy and balance out the difference of the different concerns, the different interests that are pulling us in different directions, because that allows for things to be more targeted, okay, at individuals and individual figures. And of course, it's not applicable in all kinds of situations, but at least in many, when you know who you're targeting, it can be applicable. So at a policy level, is that a way out?
So I'm going to repeat the question for the folks who are watching on streaming. Basically, the question was about the different types of vectors for attack that Chris had mentioned in the previous panel, and a lot of those are problematic, namely that they require weakening the infrastructure, using vulnerabilities that continue to exist and make everyone vulnerable, and so forth. But then there was one option that was suggested as possibly being more palatable, namely that if you work with a third party, such as Apple or Google, and have them in some way deliver malware to a particular individual, or where there's a mediation there where this can be delivered out, does that mitigate some of the problem, and what are the policy implications? Is that about right?
So it's a challenging policy issue. As probably aware, post-Snowden disclosures, a lot of companies have suffered reputational damage, have taken to writing letters, bringing lawsuits, and the ability to be more transparent. If Congress were suggesting this as the least evil of the options, so to speak, I as a company may have some concerns with that, because if I am building a reputation on user trust, where I am not, even when directed under a court order, essentially infecting a user's computer with malware, that may be very difficult for some companies. I wouldn't, there's probably a spectrum, but it does raise some very big trust issues, reputational issues, et cetera.
Did you want to respond to that also?
Just one more thing. I'm not sure it's all clear that you wouldn't take an infrastructural hit, and it would all depend on the implementation of a program like that. So, for instance, if you're going to implement it by legislating CALIA 2, which would compel all of the companies to have some sort of software opening for you to insert your malware or whatever, that would probably be a problem, in that all the other folks that want to squeeze in all that other infrastructural stuff would spread. And on the flip side, just to piggyback on Stephanie's point, at a broad level, that would basically mean that U.S. companies, or a company that's based in the United States, would have a competitive disadvantage just by virtue of being here. And I don't think that that's good policy, coming from the U.S.
All right, so we're about out of time, but I know Chris wants to ask a question, and since he's the one who brought us all here, I guess we'll go ahead and let him. All right.
Question. So last year, when we had a related conference, Judge Owsley spoke about the fact that many times judges receive applications for orders for stingrays, a different application for a pen register, and they think, oh, this is the same kind of pen register I've always received. Here you go. You've met the requirements. After looking through as many applications and warrants that I can find for hacking type technologies, the word that never appears in any of these, although Laura mentioned many other words they use to describe them, the word that never appears is the word hack or the word malware. One application that I was reviewing recently basically said the government told the judge, we have the ability to get information about a computer. Will you let us use this code to get information about the computer? They don't actually tell judges that this code exploits vulnerabilities in software. They don't tell judges that this is a virus, in essence, that it is bypassing security software. And so what I wanted to ask anyone who has an opinion on this panel is, how important is it that judges be told what they're actually authorizing, as opposed to just telling judges, hey, this is the kind of order we need, these are the legal requirements of this particular form of process, we've met the requirements. Do they need to tell judges what they're going to go and do with the order, particularly when it raises like these major policy concerns? Thank you.
Anybody want to tackle that?
Well, I'll start off. I'm always in favor of litigant candor to the court. I think if you're not really honest with a court, then that's certainly undesirable. On the other hand, judges need to be more curious and not perhaps so complacent and ready to sign what's put in front of them. I mean, that's on us. And I think we swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and that's what we need to be doing. And I think we need to be more not less attentive when we only have one party in front of the court than when we have two parties in our usual system. So, obviously, I do think they need to be candid with the court, but on the other hand, courts need to push back too.
So I want to respond both to your point and to Chris's point. So on your point, the concern that I see with it is you're putting industry in the position of being kind of the government's lapdog, and they're their enforcement arm. And I think there are enormous problems with that in terms of the aggrandizement of power and the ability of the government to just use industry to do whatever it wants to do. So I'd be very concerned about that and what that does to the reach of the government. In the same way that I'm concerned at a state and local level, for instance, about passing out Morse devices and using local law enforcement to collect fingerprint and biometric data that's then just uploaded to NGI, Next Generation Identification for the Bureau. This is using local law enforcement to do their job for them. And so I think there are concerns about what that means about separation of powers and distribution of powers, both between private industry and the government, and then between the federal government and state and local governments. So I have concerns there about the power implications of what you're suggesting. On Chris's point, I think that's terribly important, actually, that judges are very clear on what it is that they're authorizing. And I agree with you that this, it is interesting both how they're describing it and how they're not describing it in these documents themselves. And I would assume there would be a legislative fix to this to make it more transparent if and when Congress does decide to act.
I think one thing I've seen in my reporting on this issue, just to kind of wrap that up, is, one of the complaints about the law that governs a lot of this, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, is that it was written long before anybody was using these technologies. And I think it seems to me that that is part of the issue, that, law enforcement is trying to squeeze very new technologies into statutes that are, 20 years old.
So are the courts, right? And this is really concerning. So if you look at Title III, for instance, and the way in which communications are understood, video communications, we have nothing for silent video that actually has been legislated by Congress that sets the rules for Fourth Amendment purposes for silent video recording. So two circuits have said, well, we'll just adopt these rules and apply it, even though there's nowhere in the statute does it deal with silent video recording. And the Ninth Circuit, Judge Kaczynski has said, no, I'm not going to be an activist judge, and I'm not going to say that this applies to this particular context because there's nothing in the statute that says it applies. So as far as I can tell, there is no statutory authorization for silent video recording. So I think that the responsibility for that is not just on law enforcement, but actually on judges as well, to say if there is no statute there, one can apply the principles and say, and Judge Smith did in this case, and said, well, look, if we were to apply the principles, this falls outside Fourth Amendment strictures. Or one can just say, look, there is no authorization for this, and if Congress would like to create one for silent video recording, feel free, Congress, but in the interim, Judge Kaczynski, on this point I think was very strong to say we have no statutory language that covers this specific instance.
very briefly, and I think Matt's got a question, but I mean, there's this whole issue of whether you draft statutes and regulations in a technologically neutral way versus specifically directed to a particular technology. I think there's merits to both. But as a judge, if I'm faced with a request for search, a type of search using different technology, there is a default rule that I have to go to, I think, and that's Rule 41. Rule 41 generally covers searches and seizures. It doesn't specifically say with this particular type of technology, and maybe that's the way Congress wants to do it. And if that's the case, then that's what I'll try to do. That's what I tried to do.
Am I, Judge Smith, correct in you really tried very hard in the prospective location data issue to look to a statute?
Absolutely.
You didn't find a satisfactory answer. Again, as you point out, Jen, ECBA was written in 1986, before most of us had cell phones. And so ultimately that led you to evaluate the matter pursuant to Rule 41.
Right, right.
So, and Judge Bates, introduced a new rule into FISC saying if new technologies were going to be brought to the court, then the government, in most cases National Security Division, would have to present detailed legal argument as to why this fit within the statute or not. And I think that was an important alteration in FISC's rules that Judge Bates put into place as well.
So I hate to cut off the discussion. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I just want to make sure, I think, Justin, you have to catch a 5 o'clock train, so I just want to make sure nobody's... Okay, all right. So I'm happy to continue. I don't have a train until 6, but I just want to make sure they're going to kick us out.
Why don't we just do one?
Judge Smith's denial that he is the most
Here.
Very good.
Thank you.
Excellent. So on that note, I think we're getting kicked out. I'm sorry. Thank you guys so much for this discussion. I really appreciate it.